I don't often preach series of topics. Sometimes we'll see in our Protestant brothers and sisters, their churches will have a preaching series where over the course of a number of weeks, a topic will be developed. I don't do this often, but every now and again I do, and today is one of those days. In conversation with my staff earlier this week, we were talking about some of the very monumental things that we remember and celebrate during the month of January. And in light of what I shared with everyone about the meaning of the celebration of Epiphany last week, it seemed appropriate to continue the theme so as to comment on both what Scripture is saying to us this month and the things that we celebrate in our country this month. So tomorrow, we remember the legacy and the work, the mission and the voice of Dr. Martin Luther King. A week from today, on January 22nd, we remember the 50th anniversary of the Supreme Court decision of Roe versus Wade and how that changed our society in regards to the topic of life and abortion. The last Sunday of January, January 29th, we will hear the proclamation of the Beatitudes in the Gospel, and so we will hear the very foundation of what we often call today Catholic social teaching. The voice that the church has to speak into the world, a message of justice, a message to help fix the world and put the world right. This isn't a new thing, but it is often forgotten. So let's remind ourselves what we heard last week. The celebration we had last Sunday was called the celebration of the Epiphany. Now, that's not a religious word. Epiphany is not a religious word. It's used to describe the celebration because the word is applicable. Because the definition of epiphany is a sudden, surprising new insight. A new wisdom that comes in a shock or rapidly. We use that word to describe that visit of the Magi, the three kings, the wise men, bringing gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh to the child Jesus, born in poverty, born in a barn. We celebrate that day as an epiphany, and the epiphany is nothing less than the realization that Jesus is the new King of Israel. But the Epiphany doesn't end there, because the Epiphany is the realization that the ancient belief that the new King of Israel, that new King that was promised to David, one of his descendants, the new just and holy King, would not only be a King of Israel, but since God made the whole world, God's new King would be the King of the whole world. It doesn't end there either. Because the moment we acknowledge Jesus, and we say it over and over, and we sometimes don't even think about the phrase, we call him Lord, that means we're acknowledging he is our King, the King of the world. The moment we realize he's King of the world, we have to reconsider what kingship itself means. Now all of a sudden, authority and leadership is changed because Jesus looks nothing like all of the other kings and presidents and prime ministers of our world. So we have to reconsider authority itself and how authority is put into practice in our world. Now, in light of the work, the message, and some might call it the martyrdom of Dr. Martin Luther King, dying for justice, being killed because of his advocacy for the oppressed, I think we have to reflect today on the shocking way in which Jesus' ministry gives us a difficult requirement, a challenging task to continue the work of Dr. Martin Luther King and to have a sober awakening about the problem of discrepancies and racism and prejudice in our world. And here's why. Philippians chapter 2. St. Paul boldly proclaims that Jesus, though he was in the form of God, did not deem equality with God something to be grasped. Rather, he emptied himself and took the form of a slave. Jesus, in his humility, emptied himself of his divinity and entered the absolute lowest place in all of human society. Not only that, but the work of our salvation is accomplished through dying the death of a slave. Romans reserve the cruelty of the cross for only a few people, slaves being one of those groups. Roman citizens would absolutely never be crucified. This was a death that stripped someone of their humanity and their dignity. It was so horrific it was reserved primarily for slaves. And so what I would propose to you, again, in light of the work of Dr. Martin Luther King, let's take a moment and reflect on some difficult history. Beginning in the year 1619, human beings from Africa were brought to this country, bought and sold as property. That practice lasted for 246 years. Our entire society was built on those 246 years where colonies were able to muster economic growth to become powerful enough to win our freedom through revolution, and then to grow into an industrialized society on par with Europe as Europe went through the Industrial Revolution. We were able to do that primarily because humans were treated as property, and property then earned the rest of our society the ability of upward movement in the economy. In order to justify this, for 246 years, our culture and our society continually came up with narratives that were passed on directly or subtly to dehumanize those people who were treated as property, to spread misinformation that they were not as intelligent, that black people are not as industrious, they were lazy or morally weak. Whatever the narrative was, our society for 246 years had to convince ourselves that they were not human so as to justify owning them as property. It has only been 156 years and 7 months since they were liberated from slavery. We cannot undo in such a short amount of time the deep messaging that we spent so hard in our society and culture trying to learn. And so we see over and over, whether it's the thousands of lynching, the Tulsa Race Massacre in 1921, whether it was issue after issue, and I spent all week researching so much, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to tell every horrific story. But let's not forget, the problem of racism hasn't gone away. In 2015, a young man went into a church in Charleston, South Carolina, a black church, in the middle of a Bible study, massacred 9 people because they were black. In 2017, in Charleston, Charlottesville, Virginia, a white supremacy rally raged and people were killed in a counter-protest where neo-Nazis rose up and advocated for the agenda of the oppression of people. This isn't gone away. Just a few months ago, in my own home, 10 people were slaughtered in a supermarket, targeted in a black neighborhood because they were black. Buffalo, New York, this past summer. This problem has not gone away. There are so many instances that are there, but the thing is we culturally, or the media, or whatever else is going on, we do such an incredible job of filtering it out or excusing it as lone instances or singular, perverted, twisted people who have mental health issues, rather than looking in the mirror and being honest that we have a cultural and a social problem where for 246 years we tried to learn how to dehumanize people, and it's only been 156 years and 7 months since we've been trying, although nowhere near enough, to try to rehumanize them. We've got a problem that we have to be honest about. Because if we claim that Jesus is truly Lord, the King of all of creation, which is Orthodox Catholic faith, this is what we believe. His kingship then determines how we approach these issues. His way of being a king has to influence our way of living in society. Over and over and over again, Jesus associated with the lowest, the least, the marginalized, the hated. He died the death of slaves so as to liberate all of us. The very word redemption is a word that comes from the slave trade market. When somebody who was formerly enslaved is bought, their freedom is bought, and now they're liberated. They're set free from slavery. And so we rightly proclaim Jesus as the Redeemer of the world. One of the challenges of us today is we have to be honest. There are so many good sources of information out there. Personally, and I don't mean to pat myself on the back, but for years now I try to read 1 or 2 really important texts on the issue of race in our society a year so that I can constantly keep growing and learning. The reason I do this is because I'm convinced that the kingship and the authority of Jesus puts us in a position where we must likewise be an advocate and be in solidarity with those who are most oppressed in our society. We must join Jesus in emptying ourselves and taking the form of a slave, because one of the most important aspects of Catholic social teaching is solidarity. Not empathy, not compassion, not charity even, but solidarity. We must enter into the experience of those who are oppressed and marginalized and those who are poor and suffering. And by uniting ourselves with them, learning from them, listening from them, hearing their voices, letting their pain change us because we try to take it on as our own, and then living differently, reorganizing the world differently, reorganizing society according to Jesus' kingship, not our own broken politics, certainly not the American heritage of turning people into property. This is what it is for us to claim Jesus as Lord. Please, don't ever forget. Every September, when we commemorate the awful events of 9/11, we hear over and over, or every December when we commemorate the awful events of Pearl Harbor, we hear somebody somewhere telling us, never forget. Okay, I won't. We shouldn't. But yet our country, our culture, our society tries so hard to remember and never forget 9/11 or Pearl Harbor, but we are trying at the same time to forget 1619. I would propose we should never forget. We should imitate Jesus, who emptied himself, taking the form of a slave. We should hold on to the horrible memory of our past so that it becomes a light for us going into the future. Because remember what Isaiah said, it's not enough for you just to be my servants. It's not enough for you just to have personal holiness. Rather, you must be a light to the nations. This is what I'm calling you to. I'm calling you to a vocation of justice, of wisdom, and light to guide others, not just to be my servant, not just personal holiness. And so, I'd ask you, consider joining us the next 2 weeks as we continue to talk about Catholic social teaching. Consider how it is that you can learn more about the heritage in our country where we so easily and often treat people as property. Pray. Pray and ask the Lord to guide you on how He wants to be not only the king of your life, but how He wants to be the king of our culture, of our society and our world, according to His model of kingship. That's the cross.